because I asked you to read 3 different stories, I want to address all 3 in this lecture because I think they are important to this conversation about realism and naturalism. So don't be surprised if I move through them quite quickly. So if you have any questions after listening to this lecture, please don't hesitate to contact me. And I'll say this as well. I am recording at home and my dogs are out. So if there's any barking, my apologies. I'll try to edit that out in post. But I think where I want to start is just with these 2 terms. I want to foreground this conversation today by offering something of a definition of literary realism and perhaps at times by contrast, literary naturalism. Now, with that said, one of the things you'll hear me say today is this clear distinction that your book in particular wants to make between realism and naturalism is a distinction that I would argue is at times quite arbitrary, which is to say there are a lot of shared similarities between realism and naturalism, perhaps to the point that they don't seem distinct from one another. But I think you could argue there are things that writers like Stephen Crane and Jack London attempt to do with their literature that perhaps someone like Edith Wharton, by contrast, doesn't. Or there are some assumptions that they bring to a text, and there are some questions that they bring to a text, and Wharton doesn't. Again, for example, I'm just using Edith Wharton as an example today. They're not the same kinds of questions and assumptions that she might bring to a text. So, okay. Realism, just to offer some definitions, realism attempts to reject the romantic, heroic, exaggerated, and idealistic views of life, the kinds of things you see in, for example, those grand epic poems of Homer. Think about the Iliad or the Odyssey. So it's perhaps a rejection of those kinds of narratives. Instead, or in place, it offers a view of life that's perhaps more detailed, accurate description, and it's something that really prioritizes just the day-to-day lives of human beings and individuals. Just think about the word real in a word like realism. It wants to give us something that feels a bit more grounded. It's a focus on the ordinary. Naturalism, you could argue, is a response to realism because it attempts to reveal the inherent limitations or the perhaps unacknowledged focus on realism's middle class and perhaps even these nouveau riche or these new rich figures. Again, think about the Edith Wharton stories that we read. Think about Henry James and Daisy Miller. Those feel realistic. Those are following in this realism movement. But the characters, and in particular the socioeconomics of those characters, are very distinct and in some ways very limited to a certain section of this socioeconomic hierarchy. So unlike realism, naturalism focuses on certain socially marginalized figures. And I think this is quite clear in particular with Stephen Crane's The Open Boat. But the final thing that I would want to say is naturalism shifts human action away from notions of free will and self-determination, and perhaps it has a more pessimistic idea, such as biological determinism or even social determinism. And all of that is just perhaps a complicated and convoluted way of saying, perhaps in literary naturalism, there aren't these kinds of idealistic assumptions that someone's free will and someone's self-determination matters most. Perhaps there are just certain inherent limits. Maybe some of them are biological, perhaps some of them are natural, some of them are certainly socially determined at times. And we see within perhaps a literary naturalist text engagement with those limitations. And the final, perhaps, limitation worth mentioning, or the final preoccupation that, again, we might see in something like The Open Boat by Stephen Crane is just how mankind's implied supremacy is one that is placed under a kind of scrutiny. So if you think about, for example, a story like The Other Two by Edith Wharton, there is this sense that humanity and the activities of humanity matters perhaps most in the world. Again, humanity is quite center in those stories. Humanity has this unmovable place at the center of all stories being told. Now, you can see again in The Open Boat, in the Jack London and Mary Austin stories, that there is this shift away from humanity, or this way of contextualizing humanity within the larger natural world. And I think what we're ultimately left to conclude, especially after reading The Open Boat, or especially after reading To Build a Fire by Jack London, is that, well, nature, it's perhaps far more ambivalent towards humanity than certain stories that place humanity at the center of the world might think, especially in a story like The Open Boat. There's this sense that nature will just do what it does. And the activities, the concerns, and the preoccupations of human beings doesn't really matter at all to nature. And in that way, again, it's this shifting, or this way of refocusing our attention, again, away from the implied supremacy of humanity. And by contrast, it places humanity within this larger ecology, within this larger world. And it's a way, and I think this is perhaps what someone like Stephen Crane challenges us to think, it's a way of perhaps assuming or thinking, well, maybe humanity isn't at the top of this chain. Perhaps humanity and perhaps humanity is subservient to these larger, more powerful natural forces. And again, that's not to suggest that humanity cannot affect whether it's positive or negative nature. I think this is something we see in Mary Austin. There's a reason why a lot of what are called eco-theoretical approaches to literature really like a figure like Mary Austin, because she, like Crane and like London, contextualizes mankind or human beings within this larger world. But she also perhaps offers this critique of humanity and this critique of humanity's behavior within this larger world. And something you see in the Austin text from today is this way that nature wants to and strives to, and it's perhaps created itself in this way that feels very self-sustaining. It's not wasteful, but then you have human beings who, according to Austin, are just unmistakably wasteful. So, and I'll get to that story in just a few minutes, but those are just a few comments on literary realism and literary naturalism. Again, I think the distinctions are not nearly as stark as the book might want you to think, but that's, again, not to suggest that there aren't distinctions worth thinking about and worth understanding. So with that said, let's transition to some of the stories. So with Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, there are a couple of just general questions that I would encourage you to think about as you reflect on this story. Maybe this is a story you want to write about for the unit essay. And here are those questions. Number one, even though Crane concludes that nature is indifferent to the plight of humans, how and to what degree does he humanize nature? For example, at the end, the sea has a voice. Number two, what does Crane suggest about class and male friendship? Ultimately, what brings these men together? And three, this story, again, is a wonderful example of naturalism. How does it ascribe to some of the naturalistic techniques that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture? And those are really the three, broadly speaking, the 3 points that I will discuss when discussing The Open Boat. I want to certainly think about how Crane depicts and characterizes nature. I certainly want to think about what this story says about male companionship, especially in these kinds of intense survival situations. And I also just want to highlight some of the ways that this is a distinctly naturalistic story. So why don't we start with just these descriptions of nature? And I think one of the best ones is early in the story, section 1 on page, this is 1049. And I'm reading at about the middle of the page. It's the paragraph that begins with a singular disadvantage, and I'll read just most of that paragraph. A singular disadvantage of the sea lies in the fact that after successfully surmounting one wave, you discover that there is another behind it, just as important and just as nervously anxious to do something effective in the way of swamping boats. In a 10-foot dinghy, one can get an idea of the resources of the sea in the line of waves that is not probable to the average experience, which is never at sea in a dinghy. As each slaty wall of water approaches, it shut all else from the view of the men in the boat, and it was not difficult to imagine that this particular wave was the final outburst of the ocean, the last effort of the grim water. There was a terrible grace in the move of the waves, and they came in silence, save for the snarling of the crests. So, a couple of interesting things here. First, just notice how unrelenting this body of water is. And this is something that Crane, of course, dramatizes throughout the story. But like waves, like the ocean, it within the narrative seems to ebb and flow. There are these moments, and I think this is part of the larger trajectory for these characters. There are moments when they think they've successfully defeated the sea, but of course it comes roaring back, it seems, with a vengeance. But just notice these moments when Crane uses the kind of language someone would use to describe a person, but he uses it to describe the sea, to in effect describe nature. This way that he personifies nature is quite interesting, because this is one of the ways that you could perhaps imagine or argue that even though there are four human characters in the story, there's this fifth but not to be dismissed or not to be overlooked character, the sea. And just some of those details, quote, the sea is, according to Crane's narrator, nervously anxious to do something effective in the way of swamping boats. It's nervously anxious. Later in the paragraph, the ocean, it has these outbursts. Again, we don't often associate, because what does it mean for something to have an outburst that feels like something derived from emotions, right? We often, I have a 5-year-old son, he has emotional outbursts, right? But I would never imagine describing the ocean or the sea as having outbursts, because that implies that it has this kind of emotion that might produce these sorts of feelings. But in Crane's hands, this body of water certainly feels that way. We're also told the ocean, as it moves, it has a, quote, terrible grace. Notice the irony here. It's graceful, but it's terrible and it's haunting. So, and again, you see this repeatedly. I think if you just pay attention to it, you see how Crane deploys these kinds of descriptive phrases as a way of offering this picture of nature that at times feels more complex and more nuanced than he seems to offer any of the human characters. Perhaps another example is just on the next page, 1050, and this is not the ocean, this is not the water, but it's this moment with these birds, and this paragraph where the narrator describes what it's like to see these birds watching them in their precarious position. And this is at the bottom of page 1050. The birds sat comfortably in groups, and they were envied by some in the dinghy, for the wrath of the sea was no more to them than it was to a covey of prairie chickens 1,000 miles inland. Often they came very close and stared at the men with black, bead-like eyes. At these times, they were uncanny and sinister in their unblinking scrutiny, and the men hooted angrily at them, telling them to be gone. One came and evidently decided to alight on the top of the captain's head. The bird flew parallel to the boat and did not circle, but made short sidelong jumps in the air in chicken fashion. And I'll stop there again. Notice these birds, by contrast to these men who are just packed into this small boat without freedom, without agency, these birds have all of that. So much so that they actually mock these four poor men, and they seem to flaunt their freedom. So again, if we just think of the birds as an extension of the sea and perhaps again as part of this extended personification of just nature at large, we can almost see nature mocking these men, mocking their situation, and perhaps mocking their hubris or their assumptions that they could exercise any real control or power over something as powerful as nature. And maybe one final example is just at the end of the story, the way Crane leaves us, this final description of nature in those final two paragraphs. And this is on page 1064. It seems that instantly the beach was populated with men with blankets, clothes and flasks, and women with coffee pots and all the remedies sacred to their minds. The welcome of the land to the men from the sea was warm and generous, but a still and dripping shape was carried slowly up the beach, and the land's welcome for it could only be the different and sinister hospitality of the grave. When it came night, the white waves paced to and fro in the moonlight, and the wind brought the sound of the great sea's voice to the men on shore, and they felt that they could then be interpreters. So notice here at the end, the ocean, this body of water, this great sea, it is just as it has always been. It seems unchanged and unaffected by the horrifying and harrowing experience that these four men endured. But what's interesting here is how they are now, after this experience, in a position to interpret perhaps what happened to them. And I would just encourage you to notice how, again, this is something of an inversion of what we see or some of the assumptions we see in literary realism, where the assumption is that humanity is at the center of all things. Again, this is a way of imagining that the world is what's called an Anthropocene, or it's an environment where humanity is supreme. Everything else defers to humanity. But notice here, humanity defers to nature, right? Humanity's left to interpret nature. Nature is not in a position to interpret humanity. Not that it seems in Crane's hands, it's too terribly interested to do that. So my point, I suppose, is if we're just thinking about, or if we wanted to indulge these sorts of hierarchies or this hierarchical thinking, notice for Crane, humanity's in this subservient position, left to interpret something that it doesn't fully understand, perhaps something more powerful than it, something more elusive than it. And I think this is, again, an interesting bit of commentary on the sorts of assumptions that so many pieces of literature make, where, again, humanity seems to be not only at the top of these sorts of hierarchies, but the world is humanity. The world wouldn't exist without humanity. That's the kind of assumption that so many stories, so many novels and plays, that's the assumption that these texts make. But for Crane, this whole story feels like a process of inverting that assumption. Now, I also wanted to spend a few minutes talking about just the way this story grapples with, or the way this story dramatizes male friendship, male companionship, especially in these kinds of harrowing and stressful moments. This is on, for example, page 1051, the beginning of section 3. it would be difficult to describe the subtle brotherhood of men that was here established on the seas. No one said that it was so. No one mentioned it. But it dwelt in the boat, and each man felt it warm him. They were a captain, an oiler, a cook, and a correspondent, and they were friends in a more curiously iron-bound degree than may be common. The hurt captain, lying against the water jar in the bow, spoke always in a low voice and calmly, but he could never command a more ready and swiftly obedient crew than the motley three of the dinghy. It was more than a mere recognition of what was best for the common safety. There was surely in it a quality that was personal and heartfelt. And after this devotion to the commander of the boat, there was this comradeship that the correspondent, for instance, who had been taught to be cynical of men, knew even at the time was the best experience of his life, but no one said that it was so. No one mentioned it. So a couple of things here. First, again, for Crane, it's interesting how this harrowing experience created this sense of camaraderie, this community, but it was something left unspoken. It was felt more than it was said. And I would encourage you just to think through what that actually means. Why was it spoken? Why was it felt and not spoken? But also just the composition of this boat and how we don't really get their names necessarily, but they're defined by what they do. There's a cook, there is a correspondent, there is an oiler, there is a captain. And I think part of what's interesting about this is these are men from incredibly diverse backgrounds, it would seem. They have different sorts of professions. Again, you can just imagine a working environment. These men would not necessarily interact with one another too much, but in Crane's story, they're almost forced to interact with one another, and within that forced interaction, they form a bond and they form a companionship that is quite visible to us as readers. And what I think is interesting about this is how we often, and Crane says as much, especially when thinking about a figure like the correspondent, who also feels like a proxy figure for Crane, how he was encouraged to be quite cynical about men and mankind, about human beings, about their ability to perhaps work together to find commonality in any situation. But what seems to tie or connect these men is, despite their diverse backgrounds, their collective sense of lack, which is to say their collective inability to really do anything in this situation. Even though they do different things, even though they probably have different educational and socioeconomic backgrounds, they do share something. And I would argue this is one of the times where Crane gives us perhaps this universal picture of humanity, or he's making something of a universal gesture, that the thing that all of us share, the thing that connects all of us together is our shared lack, this sense that we are all incomplete beings, and we see how that is something that is not spoken on this boat, but it is something that seems to form this little community on this boat. And in that way, I think this is one of the more optimistic moments of the story. Even though they experience something quite horrifying, they recognize one another's lack. They recognize how ill-equipped they are to confront this problem and this danger, and they're really left to just survive it. There's no conquering nature. There's only surviving it. And with that said, I think it's again worth emphasizing what if this story had a thesis statement, what that thesis statement might be, and what all of these characters seem to understand as they endure this experience. And if you look, for example, at the bottom of page 1059, this is about as clear as we might get of a thesis statement for this story. When it occurs to man that nature does not regard him as important, and that she feels she would not maim the universe by disposing of him, he at first wishes to throw bricks at the temple, and he hates deeply the fact that there are no bricks and no temple. Any visible expression of nature would surely be pelleted with his jeers. Then, if there be no tangible thing to hoot, he feels perhaps the desire to confront a personification and indulge in pleas, bowed to one knee, and with hands supplicant, saying, "Yes, but I love myself." A high cold star on a winter's night is the word he feels that she says to him. Thereafter he knows the pathos of his situation. The men in the dinghy had not discussed these matters, but each had, no doubt, reflected upon them in silence and according to his mind. There was seldom any expression upon their faces, save the general one of complete weariness. Speech was devoted to the business of the boat. To chime the notes of his emotion, a verse mysteriously entered the correspondent's head. He had even forgotten that he had forgotten this verse, but it suddenly was in his mind. And I'll come back to this verse or this story in just a moment, but what I think is quite interesting about what Crane offers us here is how, and I didn't read this part, but it's almost worth reading. It's the paragraph before. Quote, "For it was certainly an abominable injustice to drown a man who had worked so hard. And this is something this is almost a mantra, it seems, that we hear several times throughout the story. But think about what that ultimately means. Working hard and then receiving a kind of justified compensation for one's hard work. This is very much the central idea of the American dream. But Crane here, he does two interesting things. The first is he highlights just how much of a narrative construct that is, and how nature is, in many ways, utterly disinterested in the sorts of narratives that human beings tell themselves about themselves. That once you get that, and for Crane, it seems as if this is so important to get that. There are not these larger meta-narratives that are true. They're only true insofar as you're willing to and prepared to recycle them and reinforce them. But once you get that they're not ordained in nature, according to Crane, your reaction is not one of acceptance, but it's actually one of belligerence. You want to find someone to attack or punish for this lie you've been told. And it seems for Crane, part of what these men need to begin to understand after experiencing this harrowing situation is just that. So much of our lives is dictated and determined by these narratives, these larger stories that, while they might feel true for many people, and while there's certainly something aspirational about them, there's nothing natural about them. It's something that we just produce as a species, as a collective. And that's not to say, and I think this is something I would encourage you to think about, is Crane arguing that we should just abandon and jettison those narratives, or is he perhaps suggesting that we need to revise and modify those narratives? And if we wanted to say one final thing about this story, and in particular about this idea or this notion or these notions that there are these larger narratives that we tell ourselves that become so ingrained in how we think about ourselves and about the world that we almost start to assume or believe them as natural. we should probably look to who lives and who dies at the end of this story, because this is in many ways a narrative that wants to challenge certain narratives, because the one who is most equipped to survive, Billy, the oiler, is the one who dies. And I think for Crane, that bit of subversion is so important. Again, this helps to gesture towards this larger point he wants to make about, again, just how utterly indifferent nature is to the preoccupations and the activities of mankind, because the oiler really feels like our hero, doesn't he? He feels, if you think about that classic hero archetype, the oiler feels like that guy. He feels like Oedipus. He feels like Achilles. He feels like some of Shakespeare's grandest heroes, someone like Henry V in the Henriade, those series of plays about this king that in Shakespeare's canon becomes one of his most celebrated kings. The oiler feels like he's following in that lineage, but here at the end, he's not left to survive and thrive. Again, think about if you are someone who likes contemporary superhero movies, it's extremely rare for the hero to die at the end of the story. Now, there's always a moment, or at the end of the film, there's always a moment when I think the narrative wants us to think they might die, but they always punch the bad guy in the face, they win the day, yada, 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 and they're characters who also follow in this lineage, and Billy the oiler feels, again, a part of that lineage, but he dies even though he seems to fit so neatly and so naturally into that lineage. And I would encourage you just to think about, well, why would Crane do that? Is this, again, part of his larger point about mankind's place in the world, that nature doesn't acknowledge Billy's symbolic status as someone who fits within that heroic lineage? Well, I think Crane, if he were here, would probably say yes. I think that's precisely his point. Nature doesn't care. Nature doesn't care about the sorts of narratives that we tell ourselves. Nature doesn't care about the history of stories that help us understand or have assisted in our understanding of what good and evil is, so on and so forth. Nature is just utterly indifferent to those stories we tell ourselves, and perhaps by extension, nature is utterly indifferent to us. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about The Open Boat. Once again, an interesting story, an interesting example of literary naturalism, but for now, let us transition to Jack London's To Build a Fire. So some of the themes, and I've already mentioned some of this before, but I'll repeat it. Some of the themes in this story, man versus nature, in particular, the importance of instincts, and just what death might look like. Again, just attempting to dramatize this process, and this is something we see a bit in The Open Boat as well. But I think perhaps one of the distinctions, if we wanted to do a kind of compare and contrast, one of the distinctions between To Build a Fire and The Open Boat is this clear critique, and perhaps it's just clearer in London, this clear critique of self-reliance or the power of the individual. Because I think the sense of hubris this man, this unnamed character, exudes in this story, it's something that London clearly wants us to think about and ruminate over in as much detail as possible. Because, again, one of those larger narratives that we tell ourselves, especially in this country, is the individual is perhaps more important than the collective. We value and celebrate the power of the individual, but here, London, he seems to offer an interesting critique of that idea, and he wants to perhaps show or demonstrate the limits of that kind of thinking when perhaps taken to a kind of extreme, or maybe, and I think you could make this argument, just that kind of thinking unto itself, even if it's not taken to a kind of extreme. And I think one of the places where we see this, and this is at the end of the story, so hopefully you've read the story already, is when this man comes to this realization that not only is he about to die, but his death could have been avoided if he had only listened to this old man at Sulphur Creek. So this is at the bottom of 1120. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right. He thought in the moment of controlled despair that ensued. After 50 below, a man should travel with a partner. He beat his hands, but failed in exciting any sensation. So what I think, and this is perhaps a moment when what this old man, this old timer represents is the kind of collective wisdom that we have accumulated, and in particular, the folly of rejecting that collective wisdom, because there's this sense that, again, perhaps metaphorically, this older man who offers this warning earlier in the story, he's not just an individual speaking from an individual experience or an individual set of experience. He's perhaps speaking on behalf of humanity as a collective. Perhaps he's even speaking for us, the audience, right? And I think this is something we see quite often in horror films. If you've ever had this moment or this experience when you see a character or a couple of characters walking toward a house and you know that something bad is about to happen and you're practically shouting at the screen, "Don't go into that house. What are you doing?" You're just desperately trying to and attempting to communicate with them, but you can't and they die. We know how that works. And I think something quite similar happens here where this old man, again, he speaks not only on behalf of this collective wisdom that humanity has accumulated, but perhaps he now, we realize, speaks on behalf of us, the audience. And I won't necessarily cite a particular moment from the text for this next point because I think it just appears and surfaces so often. But, and I mentioned this a moment ago, this is very much a story that wants to interrogate just the hubris of humanity, and in particular how arrogant we can be and how in so many situations we create the conditions for our own demise. And it's interesting because this is a much smaller story when thinking about the number of characters, but it's perhaps worth thinking about, well, what sort of function does this dog have in this story? Why is the dog important and significant? And I think it's really as a way of offering, perhaps again through comparison, a critique of how this man thinks and behaves. And in that way, the dog is very much a foil for this human character, because the thing that really defines the dog are its instincts, or are his instincts. The dog's instincts create this situation where he knows exactly how perilous this is, and he knows, I suppose, this is just a bad idea, right? But despite what this dog ultimately represents, and despite those moments when the dog even seems to try and communicate to this man that this is a bad idea, the man, of course, doesn't listen. But I did want to mention one passage early in the story. This is on 11:14 and 11:15. At the man's heels trotted a dog, a big native husky, and I think this is important. The dog is native to this place. The dog knows things this man cannot know. It just has that knowledge. It carries that knowledge, it seems, in its body, in its instincts. The proper wolf dog, gray-coated and without any visible or temperamental difference from its brother, the wild wolf. The animal was depressed by the tremendous cold. It knew that it was no time for traveling. Again, notice this bit of foreshadowing. The dog seems to know exactly what will happen before we perhaps know, or before this man realizes what he's done. The dog knows. Its instincts told it a truer tale than was told to the man by the man's judgment. And again, just thinking about this distinction between instincts and judgment, extremely important to this story. In reality, it was not merely colder than 50 below zero. It was colder than 60 below, than 70 below. It was 75 below zero. Since the freezing point is 32 above zero, it meant that 170 degrees of frost obtained. The dog did not know anything about thermometers. Possibly in its brain there was no sharp consciousness of a condition of very cold, such as was in the man's brain, but the brute had its instincts. It experienced a vague but menacing apprehension that subdued it and made it slink along at the man's heels, and that made it question eagerly every unwanted movement of the man, as if expecting him to go into camp or to seek shelter somewhere and build a fire. So again, what London gives us here at the beginning, this clear moment of foreshadowing where we should have a sense of what will ultimately and regrettably perhaps happen to this man if he chooses to do what he does. And just again, this sense that throughout this entire story, and if we're thinking again, I mentioned this with the open boat, these kinds of narratives and stories that we tell ourselves. One of the things that we tell ourselves, one of the characteristics of humanity that separates us and perhaps makes everything else inferior to us is our ability to judgment, our brains, our intellect. That's what really distinguishes us. And again, for many, at least as the narrative goes, that's what places us in this supreme position above animals and creatures that only have their instincts. But notice, for someone like London, he's offering a clear challenge to that assumption. He offers a clear challenge to that narrative that perhaps in some situations, ironically enough, our judgment is not something that helps us, but it's something that creates the conditions for our demise, because our judgment, it seems, according to London, has quieted our ability to actually listen to our instincts, unlike this native husky that only has instincts, but its instincts are quite clear, and what its instincts tell it are quite clear, which is, don't do this. This is dangerous. This is perilous. We should just go find a fire, right? And I think we see this mirrored at the end of the story, because again, the man does not survive. The man dies, but the dog doesn't. And I'll just read here from 11:24. Then the man drowsed off into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting. The brief day drew to a close in a long, slow twilight. There were no signs of a fire to be made, and besides, never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. As the twilight drew on, its eager yearnings for the fire mastered it, and with a great lifting and shifting of 4 feet, it whined softly, then flattened its ears down in anticipation of being chidden by the man. But the man remained silent. Later the dog whined loudly, and still later it crept close to the man and caught the scent of death. This made the animal bristle and back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leapt and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and trotted up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew. Where were the other food providers and fire providers? So here, again, this dog's instincts are unmistakable. The moment it senses this man's dead, it doesn't stay much longer. But London does this interesting thing where he seems to attempt to describe what this dog, if it's thinking at all, what it's thinking, how it's processing this information, and this bit at the end where the dog thinks of human beings as food providers and fire providers. I think this is so fascinating because, again, it's this way of shifting our understanding of, or this implied understanding of, the supremacy of mankind. Because for this animal, human beings, they are valuable insofar as they provide food and fire, right? We are very much, according to this animal, reducible to what we do to keep it alive and comfortable. That's it. That's all we do. For this dog, all that matters, all we represent is survival, but not our survival, but the dog's survival. And I think that is so fascinating how, again, this story ends not with a celebration of mankind and mankind's supremacy in the world, but again, a kind of subjugating of mankind, according to this dog, defined by nothing more than its ability to provide food and fire. We are just tools, it seems. For this dog, that is all we are. And again, we can see with London, similar to Crane, this challenging of humanity's supremacy in the world. And now I'll say a quick something about Mary Austin, because I think she's attempting to do similar sort of work. So I think where I want to begin, if you follow the link, this is on page 137 of the story. It's the paragraph at the bottom of that page that begins, "Probably we never fully credit the interdependence of wild creatures and their cognizance of the affairs of their own kind. When the 5 coyotes that range the Teon from Pasteria to Tunawa planned a relay race to bring down an antelope, strayed from the band. Beside myself to watch, an eagle swung down from Mount Pinos. Buzzards materialized out of invisible ether, and hawks came trooping like small boys to a street fight. Rabbits sat up in their chaparral and cocked their ears, feeling themselves quite safe. For the once, as the hunt swung near them, nothing happened in the deep wood that the blue jays are not all agog to tell. The hawk follows the badger, the coyote, the carrion crow, and from their aerial stations, the buzzards watch each other. What would be worth knowing is how much of their neighbors' affairs the new generations learned for themselves and how much they are taught of their elders." So notice here this, and again, the word Austin uses is interdependence. The way all of these creatures work to create and produce this environment and this atmosphere. And while it's certainly not idyllic in the way we think of, for example, Disney animated films. There's death and there's carnage, but it all works with itself and not necessarily against itself. And even this rhetorical question or notion that Austen poses at the end of this paragraph, what would be worth knowing is how much of the neighbors' affairs the new generations learn for themselves and how much they are taught of their elders just by asking the question or by posing this proposition. She seems to suggest that so much, again, potentially, so much of what these wild creatures, quote, wild creatures, learn about their environment, it's something they perhaps inherit. Again, so just seeing this environment as part of a larger tradition. But then by contrast, there's this final paragraph about mankind. And Austen, she's not ambiguous and she's not coy. She's quite direct and quite clear about what she means. This is the final paragraph on page 139. Blunder going about in the woods, and there is no other except the bear makes so much noise. Being so well warned beforehand, it is a very stupid animal or a very bold one that cannot keep safely hid. The cunningest hunter is hunted in turn, and what he leaves of his kill is meat for some other. That is the economy of nature. But with it all, there is not sufficient account taken of the works of man. There is no scavenger that eats 10 cans, and no wild thing leaves a like disfigurement on the forest floor. So again, Austen harkens back to this notion that because of the ecosystem that nature and these, quote, wild creatures have produced, there is no waste whatsoever. Even though there is blood and carnage, it's all part of this cyclical process. And everyone plays a part. Everyone has a role. But then mankind intervenes, or humans intervene. And according to Austen, they are loud, stupid animals. They make so much noise. And I think more importantly for Austen, they're wasteful. Humanity is incredibly wasteful. There is no scavenger that eats 10 cans, and no wild thing leaves a like disfigurement on the forest floor. And so for Austen, she leaves us with this impression or this idea that humanity's presence in nature is potentially not a positive one, but it's unmistakably negative because of our, quote, blundering stupidity, our wastefulness. Again, perhaps our sense that we don't always see ourselves as part of this larger ecosystem. We think of ourselves as different, as separate, perhaps because we are, again, this narrative that we tell ourselves that we are at the top of this hierarchy that might afford us the opportunity to just do whatever we want. But for writers like Austen, London, and Crane, I hope what these readings have shown you or suggested is what a challenge to that assumed or implied supremacy might and can look like, and how this idea that humanity is at the center of the world, humanity is at the center of Earth and all of Earth's activities, that kind of way of seeing us is as much a narrative that we tell ourselves as anything else. And perhaps it might behoove us to challenge some of those narratives, to rethink some of those narratives. And if we do so, what might that look like? Okay, I think that's all I want to say for this week. If you have any questions about any of the reading, please don't hesitate to contact me. And until we speak next time, this is Colin Cox for Modern American Literature. Have a nice day, everyone.